What began as an ordinary day inside the gilded walls of Clarence House spiraled into one of the most emotionally devastating moments in royal history. Prince William, steady, composed, and always in control, was rendered utterly speechless. In a moment no one could have foreseen, King Charles dropped a revelation that pierced the heart of the future king. Diana's secret letters were never meant for him. They were for Harry only. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began without warning. No briefing, no indication. Just a father summoning his son for what seemed like a routine private discussion. The air inside Clarence House was deceptively calm. William, as always, entered with the grace and obligation expected of the heir apparent. But as he sat across from his father, something was off. Charles's face was heavy, not with age, but with the burden of a truth long suppressed. The king fumbled with a small stack of letters sealed in aging envelopes, each one inked in a familiar hand. The moment William saw her script, his heart clenched. Diana, a name that still lived like a shadow in every corner of their lives. He assumed, naturally, these were his, that his mother's voice, finally unburied, would be speaking to him. But then came the words that shattered everything. These weren't written for you, William. They were meant for Harry. All of them. Time froze. William couldn't respond. He stared at the papers, then at his father. Something didn't make sense. For decades, he'd lived with the notion that he and his mother had shared a unique connection, one forged through public grief, royal expectation, and the role he was destined to inherit. And yet, in an instant, that belief was ripped from him. The implications rushed in like a tide. Why hadn't he known? Why had Charles kept them hidden? And why would Diana choose to speak to Harry and not him? The silence in the room grew dense. Charles, uncharacteristically, offered no comfort, no further explanation, just silence. His eyes were almost apologetic, but his lips remained sealed. William's breath grew shallow as memories began to resurface. Childhood moments with Diana, her touch, her gaze, her whispered reassurances when the cameras weren't looking. Had he misread all of it? Had she been shielding him while placing her hope in someone else? He wanted to speak, to demand answers, but the words refused to come. His mind was tangled in confusion, his emotions flaring between betrayal, sorrow, and disbelief. The idea that his own mother, his guiding light in a palace often shrouded in shadows, had left something so intimate, so monumental, solely for Harry, was like a blade wielded by the man now wearing the crown. And still Charles said nothing more. His silence wasn't ignorance, it was choice. A choice that said, this truth, William, is one I cannot rewrite for your comfort. In the days that followed, William avoided the topic. His public face remained composed, but those close to him knew something was deeply wrong. Behind closed doors, the future king began to question not just the meaning of the letters, but the very foundation of his place within the family. His relationship with Diana had always been his emotional compass. Now it felt like a lie. If her most personal thoughts were reserved for Harry, what did that say about the role she expected him to play? And yet, the deeper pain wasn't the letters themselves, it was the timing. Why now? Why did Charles choose this moment to reveal such a devastating truth? The answers, it seemed, were not going to come from the king, and so William was left to sit with the silence, holding on to envelopes he was never meant to open, haunted by a voice he thought had always been speaking to him. But what could have driven Diana to leave behind a trove of deeply personal letters and entrust them not to her firstborn heir, but to the younger son walking a darker, more rebellious path? Long rumored but never confirmed, Princess Diana's private writing was said to be locked away in a vault guarded by silence and guilt. Now, for the first time, the veil is lifting, and what lies beneath threatened to append everything the public thought they knew about her final days. These weren't casual notes, these were instructions. Please, and they were never meant for William. For years, whispers echoed through the palace sea. Corridors of a sealed safe housed deep within a private estate, its contents classified as maternal legacy. Few were allowed to even acknowledge its existence, let alone access it. What it held was not gold, not jewels, but something far more volatile. The voice of a woman, long silenced. Diana's letters, dozens of them written in her unmistakable, emotive script, addressed not to the throne's future king, but to his younger brother. The key to this vault rested in the hands of palace trustees, individuals bound by discretion, fear, and loyalty to a monarchy built on appearances. When Charles finally obtained the letters, it was not with joy or reverence, but with hesitation. And what he read shook him, not because of what they said, but because of who they were meant for and who they were. The decision to withhold them from William was not immediate, it was strategic. Charles consulted his closest advisors, Those who understood the palace's survival relied not on truth but on control. What if the letters revealed Diana's mistrust of the institution? What if she confessed doubts about the crown's intentions, even for her own sons? Those around Charles feared that making these letters public, or even sharing them with the family, would unleash a reckoning that could fracture the royal foundation. And so, they remained hidden, wrapped in silence, with only a select few aware of their existence. Inside those envelopes were not simple reflections of a mother's love. They were laced with coded messages, symbols, repeated phrases, and names that didn't appear in official palace records. Diana spoke of her visions, of spiritual dreams she couldn't explain but felt deeply. She warned of forces at play within the royal sphere that would seek to twist her sons against one another. Her fears weren't vague, they were visceral. Yet what cut the deepest was how she wrote to Harry. The tone was different, raw, vulnerable, and fiercely protective. She didn't instruct him as a prince. She pleaded with him as a mother who saw danger ahead. For William, there was nothing. Not a single word in those pages addressed to him directly. His name was mentioned, yes, but always with a painful distance, as if Diana feared he would be swallowed by the very machine she once tried to escape. Even after her death, senior aides were instructed to destroy any rumor of the letter's existence. Media leaks were shut down before they reached headlines. Ghostwriters and historians were subtly steered away from digging too deep. The monarchy knew that these letters had the power to rewrite Diana's legacy, and not in a way that served the crown. It wasn't just about what she said, it was about why she said it only to Harry, a question that grew heavier with each passing year, as William unknowingly carried the weight of a silence crafted by design. But why Harry? Why the so-called spare and not the heir? The answer lies not in bloodlines but in secrets that Diana believed William would never be allowed to carry. In the depths of her handwritten letter, one chilling line keeps resurfacing. They will use William as a shield. Diana wasn't simply fearing for herself, she was predicting a future where her elder son would be weaponized by the very institution she was desperate to escape. What did she see coming that the rest of us couldn't? These weren't the ramblings of a paranoid woman. These were the warnings of someone who had already seen behind the curtain and knew how far the firm would go to preserve its image. Diana saw William not just as her son, but as a tool the crown would mold into its perfect heir. He would be polished, disciplined, and above all silent. She feared that silence. In her private letters, she painted a chilling picture of a system so invested in survival that it would willingly suppress one child in order to preserve the illusion through another. William, she believed, would be trained not to ask, not to challenge, but to carry the burden with a clenched jaw and a rehearsed smile. It wasn't love she doubted, it was the structure around him. The same structure that had crushed her spirit, that had dismissed her warnings, that had watched her unravel. But while Diana mourned what William would be forced to become, she pinned her hopes on Harry. Time and again, her letters referred to him as the wild one, the untamed soul. The spark she feared would be extinguished if not protected. To Diana, Harry was more than a son. He was the chunk. To break the cycle. She wrote of him with the language of faith, calling him the flame in a palace of shadows. Where William would become the mask, Harry would remain the fire. Her spiritual advisors, psychics, and even journalists she trusted echoed her concerns. They told her things she believed, that the crown would lean on William to keep the walls standing, while isolating Harry to stop him from shaking them. Diana didn't want to believe it, but she recorded it all, page after page of conversations, cryptic metaphors, and foreboding symbols. These weren't just letters, they were a prophecy, and when excerpts were finally read aloud to William, it wasn't rage that overtook him. It was heartbreak. The emotional toll was brutal. To hear his mother's voice, reverent, mournful, desperate, casting him as a pawn rather than a partner in her struggle, was a wound that ran deeper than any public scandal. It didn't matter how many engagements he'd carried out, how many speeches he'd given in her name. To Diana, he was already lost the moment he accepted the crown's script. That knowledge haunted him. It followed him into council meetings, into family gatherings, even into moments with his own children. Was he repeating the cycle? Was he becoming the very shield she feared? And yet, William could not bring himself to hate her. He understood her pain. He saw it now more clearly than ever. But that didn't dull the sting of being the one she gave up on to protect the other. Her trust in Harry wasn't just maternal, it was strategic. And William was left with a hollow ache, knowing he had been loved, but not chosen yet. The full force of this secret wouldn't rest solely on William's shoulders because the intended recipient of Diana's final truths had no idea they were even his. When Prince Harry finally opened the velvet-bound box, he wasn't prepared for what spilled out. Pages inked in Diana's unmistakable script addressed to him, each one more revealing, more devastating than the last. As the truth tore through his reality, Harry didn't weep. He raged. And with that rage, a new storm began, one that threatened to collapse what was left of royal unity. The moment he first heard whispers of the letter was not from a trusted relative, but through a leak, an anonymous tip passed to a journalist, then redirected to a source within Harry's own circle. The news hit like a thunderclap. Diana's letters, long rumored and tightly sealed within royal confines, were real. And they were addressed solely to him. Not once had his father mentioned them. Not once had William hinted. The silence had been deliberate, calculated. Meghan was the first to press him to uncover the truth, her voice steady with conviction. "If your mother wrote to you, you deserve to hear her," she told him. And so, after months of secrecy, the box arrived, delivered discreetly through a channel that bypassed royal hands altogether. What Harry found inside was more than emotional, it was volcanic. The handwriting was unmistakable. The curve of her letters, the urgency in her underlines, the intimate way she spoke directly to him, as though no time had passed. She didn't flatter him with royal titles. She called him her baby, her fire, her final hope. She wrote of fears that had kept her awake at night, of shadows that moved behind palace walls, of manipulation and betrayal that she believed would one day come for him too. Diana's voice carried pain, but it also carried warning. She told Harry to trust his instincts. She begged him not to let them silence him. She wrote of William with sorrow but with resignation. "He will have no choice," she penned. "But you, my darling boy, still can." Harry was overwhelmed, but it wasn't grief that overtook him. It was fury, not just at the system that had hidden her words, but at the man who had kept them buried, his own father. The confrontation came swift and merciless. Charles was caught off guard when Harry stormed into the private residence, fists clenched around the opened letters. He didn't wait for pleasantries. He demanded answers. Why had he never been told? Why had his mother's last messages been locked away, smothered in silence? Charles, as always, offered rationality wrapped in detachment. They weren't safe, he said. They were too emotional, too unstable. But Harry didn't want excuses. He wanted truth. And in that moment, whatever thread remained between father and son snapped entirely. But it wasn't just Charles who faced Harry's wrath. William, too, felt the blow. Harry saw his brother's silence as complicity. William, still reeling from his own shock over the contents of the letters, couldn't find the words to defend himself. The rift between them, once a hairline fracture, split open into a chasm. William saw betrayal, Harry saw betrayal returned. Trust died in that silence between them. The hurt was too deep, the pain too old, and somewhere buried within the intensity of it all was the first flicker of something dangerous, a thought forming in Harry's mind that the letters could be more than personal. They could be powerful. The things Diana had written could expose a side of the monarchy that had never seen daylight. Secrets, accusations, patterns of control. Her words were no longer just memory. They were ammunition. But what neither brother knew was that within those letters, Diana had left a coded confession, a clue point toward a secret no royal dared to speak aloud. Hidden between poetic lines and maternal wisdom, Diana embedded a riddle, one that hinted at an event, a decision, or a truth so shattering it could never be publicly acknowledged. Was this her final act of defiance, or a desperate attempt to protect her sons from a truth that would unravel the monarchy's core? As Harry read deeper into the pages, a pattern began to emerge, cryptic references to a night Diana called irreversible. She described a gathering at Kensington Palace, cloaked in secrecy and burdened with tension. It was during this night, she wrote, that a promise was made, one Charles knew he could never keep. The letter didn't explain what the promise was, only that it changed everything. There were mentions of whispered conversations behind closed doors, of Charles pacing the marble floors, and a decision that would be written in ink, but never spoken in public. The language was evasive, almost symbolic, as if she feared being too direct. But one line stood out above all: they want one prince to lead and one to fall. That line, scratched out and rewritten 3 times, haunted Harry like a ticking clock in the back of his mind. The letters also introduced a shadowy figure, referenced only as the one who watches. Diana never named them, never described their role, but the repetition of this name, always in the context of surveillance, manipulation, and control, suggested a presence beyond public understanding. The one who watches sees everything, even in silence, she wrote. Was it a metaphor? a person within the royal machinery, or something darker, more sinister, that Diana didn't dare expose fully. Royal insiders, once made aware of the references, reportedly panicked. Several of Charles's closest advisors requested emergency meetings. Some called for the letters to be resealed. Others feared that Diana had known far more than she let on, and that if decoded, her writing could bring everything crashing down. To understand the state of mind behind the cryptic entries, a handwriting expert unaffiliated with the palace was discreetly brought in. The results were disturbing. The analyst concluded that Diana had written in a heightened emotional state, marked by both clarity and urgency. She wasn't rambling, she was planning. Each flourish of her pen held purpose. Each pause suggested censorship not by someone else, but by her own fear of what could happen if she revealed too much. The expert described her writing as methodical desperation, a woman threading a needle through fire, careful not to ignite what could not be controlled. But then the letter stopped. Abruptly, no goodbye, no final thought. One entry ended mid-sentence, as if the page had been ripped out or worse, destroyed. The sudden cutoff left more questions than answers. What was Diana trying to say? What was she protecting? And more chillingly, who made sure those pages never saw the light of day? In the vacuum of silence, theories flourished. Some whispered of royal censorship. Others believed the missing pages held the one truth the monarchy could never survive. But one person held the key to unlocking these mysteries, someone who had remained silent for over 25 years. Until now, she vanished from the public eye after Diana's death, hounded by tabloids and threatened with silence. But now, decades later, one of Diana's most trusted confidantes has come forward. Her voice trembles as she speaks, but her words ignite a firestorm that may finally force the crown to confront what it buried. Her name was scrubbed from official accounts. Once a quiet constant in Diana's private world, she became a ghost after the crash in Paris. The palace, desperate to control the narrative, distanced itself from anyone who had been too close to the princess, especially those who knew what Diana had been planning. This woman, once a daily presence at Kensington Palace, had watched it all unfold from within. The tears, the rage, the suspicion. She stayed hidden out of fear, out of exhaustion, and above all out of loyalty. But that silence has a cost, and the weight of it finally became too much to carry. Now, with the letters resurfacing and the royal household once again plunged into turmoil, she's decided to speak. Her voice cracks as she recalls Diana's final weeks. She describes a woman on the edge, haunted, restless, and gripped by the feeling that time was running out. "They're watching the boys, not me," Diana had whispered one night, eyes scanning the empty hallway. It wasn't paranoia, it was something more profound. A gut-level intuition that the danger was no longer about her life, but their futures. According to the confidante, Diana had already begun drafting changes to her will. There was a phone call, urgent, shaken, where Diana begged her to find legal help. "I need to protect Harry. I don't know how much longer I have." But within days, everything changed. The car crash, the headlines, the silence. The will was never altered, the plan unfinished. And then came the most staggering claim. She insists that before Diana's death, a quiet but chilling agreement had been made within royal circle, an understanding that William would be shaped into the sovereign while Harry would be kept at bay, not cast aside completely, but never allowed too close to the inner walls of power. She feared they'd make Harry into a ghost, the confidante says, just close enough to serve the crown, never close enough to question it. That's why she believes the letters were so intense, why Diana poured everything into them. They weren't meant to destroy William. They were meant to save Harry from vanishing into the margins of a system that never forgives. Rebellion. Her belief is clear and unwavering. The letters were a mother's final shield. Not an attack on the future king, but a lifeline thrown to the son she feared would be erased. And that intention, raw, emotional, and burdened with guilt, casts new light on the pain now tearing through the brothers. Because these weren't just letters. They were a coded inheritance. One meant to awaken, one never meant to wound. But the cost of that silence, of keeping those pages hidden for so long, is now being paid in broken bonds and unspoken fury. But while emotional wounds deepened, political ramifications exploded, leading to the most unprecedented confrontation between tableaux. All future kings, in a secret meeting away from the cameras and advisors. William confronted the one person who could answer his unspoken question, why? Why wasn't he the one Diana trusted? What had he done wrong? As Harry stood across from him, the emotional gulf between brothers became a chasm, and one that may never be crossed again. The location had been chosen deliberately neutral, silent, without royal eyes or ears. William had insisted, not as the future king, but as a son who could no longer carry the weight of silence. The moment Harry walked in, tension thickened. There were no formalities, no warm greetings, just unspoken pain. William didn't explode. He didn't accuse. His voice, when it finally broke through the quiet, was low and trembled with something deeper than anger. It was grief. Grief for a mother who was gone. Grief for the answers he never received. And now, grief for the brother who had become a stranger. He asked one question. Why did she only write to you? Harry didn't flinch. He had expected this. And for once, he didn't try to soften his reply. He looked William in the eye and said, because she saw what they were doing to you, because you were becoming them. The words were sharp, a dagger of truth, or perhaps resentment thrown without apology. He told William that Diana had seen the crown shaping him into its mouthpiece, that she feared he would be silenced not by force but by duty. She knew you wouldn't break the chain, Harry said, so she gave the truth to me. What followed wasn't a debate. It was a release of decades of buried emotion. William, usually so guarded, found himself recounting childhood moments. He was the one who tried to protect Harry when their parents fought, how he had been the one to hold Harry's hand at their mother's funeral, how he had worn the crown's expectations like armor so his brother wouldn't have to. You think I didn't suffer? William said, his voice cracking. You think I wasn't broken too? You're not the only one she loved, Harry. The air between them thickened. Childhood memories turned into battlegrounds. Harry lashed back, accusing William of standing by, while the institution destroyed everything their mother stood for. William, red-eyed and shaken, insisted he had sacrificed his own freedom to keep the family together. But nothing bridged the divide, not the shared blood, not the pain, not even Diana's memory. When it ended, there was no embrace, no closure, just silence. William turned his back first. Harry didn't stop him. Two princes walked away from each other, carrying the same wound, but walking in opposite directions. And while the brothers drifted apart, the crown faced a decision. It could no longer delay what to do with Diana's letters before they destroy the institution. From within, inside Buckingham Palace, an emergency meeting unfolds. The letters are no longer a private matter, they are a national threat. Advisors are split. Some call for their permanent destruction. Others fear the fallout if the truth ever leaks. But in the eye of the storm stands Charles, haunted, cornered, and desperate to protect what's left of his reign. The air inside the Queen's private drawing room was electric with an ease. No press, no cameras, just the most trusted, most loyal, and most frightened individuals in the monarch's inner circle. The letters, Diana's letters, had finally pierced the polished surface of royal control, and they were tearing it apart from the inside. Charles sat in silence as his advisors argued. One voice warned of legal implications should the contents ever reach the public. Another insisted it was only a matter of time before someone leaked them. One aide, eyes wide with dread, said the words aloud no one dared to admit. They could destroy us. It wasn't hyperbole. What Diana had written was raw, emotional, and deeply accusatory. Her distrust of the institution, her belief in hidden agreements, her warnings for Harry, her silence toward William. If the world read these words unfiltered, uncensored, it wouldn't just spark scandal. It would call into question the moral foundation of the monarchy itself. Queen Camilla didn't hesitate. She urged Charles to end the matter swiftly, permanently. This must be buried, she said coldly. For their sake, and for yours. Her stance was simple: destruction equals survival. But Charles hesitated. For all his flaws, something in him still recoiled at the thought of erasing Diana's last truth. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was fear, or maybe he knew the act of destroying her words could be even more damning than the words themselves. Then came William's voice, clear, conflicted, and trembling with heartbreak. He pleaded for transparency, insisting that the public deserved to know the full story, that hiding the letters would only feed conspiracy. But Charles knew what William didn't say. He was asking to release the same letters that had crushed him emotionally, the same letters that had carved a canyon between him and Harry. William wasn't just pleading for the truth. He was pleading for redemption. Harry, by contrast, made no such request. He made a threat. In private correspondence intercepted days earlier, Harry had indicated he might release the letters himself if the palace failed to act. It wasn't about revenge, it was about legacy. Their mother's voice had already been silenced once. He wouldn't let it happen again. What followed was a brutal war of ideologies. The firm steeped in tradition argued for silence, for preservation of myth over exposure of pain. The younger strategists, however, feared the digital age would render secrecy impossible. One leak, one flash drive, one photograph, everything could unravel. In the end, Charles made the decision not to destroy, but to contain. The letters would be locked away, permanently sealed in a secure archive known only to a handful, not erased but hidden. A compromise that satisfied no one. But what happens when buried? Truth refuses to stay silent. When the past claws its way into the future one page at a time. They were meant to be words of love, warning and wisdom, but Diana's letters became something more. They ignited a fire that scorched through the royal family, leaving wounds too deep to mend. As William sits in quiet reflection, and Harry walks a world away, one truth remains. Diana's voice still echoes, dividing a kingdom she once tried to heal. In the weeks that followed the final decision to seal the letters, William was no longer the same man who had walked into Clarence House believing he understood his mother. Something had shifted, something that could not be undone. The heir to the throne now wore a different weight on his shoulders, not just the expectation of a nation, but the haunting knowledge that his mother had entrusted her deepest fears not to him, but to the brother who now refused to speak. He moved through engagements with a colder presence, his words calculated, his gaze distant. Advisors noticed. So did the public. Something inside him had closed off, and in its place, only question remained. Harry, once the voice of rebellion, had gone quiet. No interviews, no posts, no appearances. Those close to him described a man lost in thought, unwilling to share what had truly shaken him. He had uncovered the truth he had long sought, and yet it had come with a cost. The confrontation with William, the storm with Charles, the explosive potential of the letters, none of it had given him peace. His silence spoke louder than outrage ever could. The only thing more powerful than what he might say was what he now chose to withhold. Meanwhile, a restless public began to stir. Word of the letters' existence had spread beyond palace walls, and demands for their release grew louder. Journalists, historians, and royal watchers entered the debate. Was it time to let the people hear Diana's voice? Had the monarchy learned nothing from its past mistakes? Or were they once again choosing preservation over truth? Some believed Diana had foreseen all of this, that she knew her sons would become the symbols of a larger fracture. Others argued her fears were never meant to see daylight, that her words were private pain, not prophecy. But one line, one chilling, poetic line continued to resurface across newsrooms and podcasts alike. If they ignore this, the crown will fall not by force, but by fracture. And as pressure mounted, Charles found himself more isolated than ever, once flanked by advisors, now surrounded by doubt. The decision to reveal the letters to his sons had set everything in motion. What he hoped would bring resolution had instead unearthed generations of silence, division, and grief. He now stood alone in his reign, haunted not by what he had done, but by what he couldn't stop. The image of Diana, once a media weapon, had become something far more dangerous, a conscience that refused to die. A voice immortalized, not in marble or portraits, but in ink, because in the end, it wasn't betrayal, scandal, or rebellion that shook the monarchy. It was a mother's final whisper that echoed louder than the crown ever could. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.